And I will introduce, this is letter 4, the Emperor.
So do you want me to begin with a little synopsis? Letter 4, the Emperor, which, having finally just gotten through the whole letter, and it's always tough, especially when you leave it to the last minute, which I did. Uh, so I was cramming, but I have come to I want to just call it by a catchphrase, and I would call it the letter of the contemplative, contemplation, and what contemplation means in the Hermetic philosophy. So this letter is introduced. He talks about the power of authority. What does authority mean? And that authority, he uses the symbols. The main symbols in this are the scepter, the shield, the man, the way he's positioned. He's got a heavy crown. He is neither sitting nor standing. His legs are crossed, so he's neither moving forward nor back. He holds a scepter, and he has a shield down next to the throne, and he is positioned near a throne. And he's in an open expanse of sky and grass, which is also mentioned. But to go just really quickly over it, he goes over the elements of the symbology of the different elements and how they relate to the Hermetic philosophy. And it seems to me it's about harnessing the personal imagination and harnessing personal thinking. It's about restraining action and restraining the lower basic 4 liberties of the human impulses. And I won't go into the 4 liberties, but they're the 4 human liberties. So he renounces these. And so there's renunciation, and that the essence of authority is renunciation to the power of the throne. The power of the throne turns out to be, the position of the throne turns out to be the post of Anthropost, the post of the representative of humanity, the post of human representing humanity. And that's the bottom line. So you can apply this to monarchies, all monarchies. Then he talks about the 4-fold emptiness. And what the emptiness is about. That strange word that he uses is simsom, the withdrawal of God. Okay. And so, and I'm skipping over stuff. I want to get on with this. He talks about the mystery of the God of love and the mystery of the crucifixion. And that Christianity, the essence of Christianity, one of the essences of it is that it does not idolize power, and that much of what goes on in the world is an idolatry of power. And so it is the mystery of faith is that for our sake he was crucified under Pontius Pilate, he suffered death and was buried. That is the essential mystery, because it's God becoming powerless, God powerlessness. Then he goes on and talks about freedom. And then he talks about what freedom is, very important stuff. And he talks about the meonic element and the pleronic element, the void and the plenitude, very important. Then he touches upon the subject of sacrifice. So very, very important. Sacrifice will come up again. Then he goes into the importance of hierarchy, the Hermetic method. The reflection of hierarchy is a reflection of divine order. There's always problems, and we'll probably be discussing hierarchy. That's always sort of a sticking point for people, especially those who grew up in what they consider to be a democracy. So there's some ideas that one has to really question when you're going through these things. The Hermetic method basically is an expansive method of thinking. I look at it as quantum thinking, holographic thinking as opposed to linear connected thinking. It is it is always as a live link to revelation. Then he talks about the book of Revelation, Apocalypse, what that is, and then he summarizes the four things we've reached so far. The magician, number one, representing concentration without effort. The high priestess, representing vigilant inner silence. And these are spiritual practices that he's summarizing. Number three, the letter 3, which is the high priestess, represents the inspired activity of thought and imagination when it's linked with superconsciousness. Conscious action linked with superconsciousness. And then number 4 is contemplation. Number 4 would be contemplate. The emperor represents the powers of contemplation. And then he moves on into the importance of depth, that Hermetic philosophy teaches not what to ask, but how to ask and how we develop depth. And Hermeticism as alchemy, a means of transformation and sublimation. And he introduces the subject of the rose cross, the cross being the place of crucifixion, and the rose representing the blooming, the sublimation of human nature to its higher nature. And he talks about the 4 wounds. He describes the emperor as representing the 4 wounds, which is the positions of paralysis of the normal human functions in order to develop the higher functions. But then he talks about the 5th wound, that there need to be 5 wounds. And the 5th wound will be introduced in the Pope. There you go. There you have it. Cliff notes.
Thank you, Alice.
I haven't got through all the arcana at all yet, but I think among the ones that I have looked at, the Emperor is my favorite, though I wonder why Alice, for her, it is contemplation. Now, I didn't pick that up at all a bit, so perhaps, Alice, you might want to put me right on this. For this, it was the Emperor keeping in balance what we have learned from the magician and from the high priestess and from the Empress, and not only keeping them in balance, but actually allowing them to have the last word. He is deliberately positioned so he can't move forward or backwards or do any offensive or defensive position. He has sacrificed his movement to leave all initiative in that way to God. And similarly, that awful crown on his head, which looks very big and uncomfortable, among other things, that symbolizes him saying, yes, it isn't a question of my bright ideas. It is a question of what God is saying to me, through my heart. And all these other earthly renunciations that Alice was talking about, these are not simply saying no to the good things in life and its possibility. It's simply being open to their fulfillment in God and through God. So he is my favorite. And perhaps I could share with you something that's happened to me in the past 2 days, as near as that. When I'm starting my meditation, I usually do it in the words, "Into your hands, O Lord," placing my hands, my life in God's hands. But then something was saying, is this just a little bit too close to your comfort zone? Because you're very happy to be in the hands of people. Amazingly and stupidly, I rather enjoyed my time of cancer in the hospital because people were looking after me. I was in their hands. That just suited me, the sort of weird person that I am. And I found myself drawn to saying, into your hands, O Lord, I stand. Into your hands I stand. And I thought, this is what the emperor is saying. In the one sense, he is offering his life to God, but he's also doing it from a standing posture. What later on in the chapter he talks about, is it noumenal maturity, something like that. And I thought, yes, this is what the emperor is seeking to teach me. So thank you, everybody, for listening to that. That is Goldsmith.
Thank you.
I'd like to answer about contemplation.
Mm.
Contemplation represents one of the spiritual practices that he's offering. He is saying that everything unfolds from the spiritual practices because Hermetic philosophy is always grounded in experience. And therefore, when you're sitting and standing in the hands of God, that is you striving to be in a contemplative state.
Mm.
So that is a contemplative practice, which is very important to develop that, because that's how we develop our ability to be detached from the course of human affairs. But it's not detached. It's detached only in the way that Christ was crucified on the cross. It represents crucifixion. Contemplation is a place of crucifixion. It's a place of being affixed. Okay. And this affixedness is the creation within the self of the void. The void, this simsum, which is the withdrawal of God. And this dynamic of the withdrawal of God to make that void, to make that space, which is what the act of contemplation is. It's an attempt to create a void in the personality. All right. It is a way to create space so that the divine pleroma can infill. The pleromic plenitude, the fullness of divinity can infill. Thank you. That's all I really want to say.
Thank you, Alice.
Tell me if I'm understanding this correctly. At the beginning, he's talking about that the human bearer of true authority cedes his place by renouncing four different things. And one being the personal opinion, and he refers to this as the intellectual initiative. And the second was personal action. The third is movement. The fourth is personal mission. Now, is that the four? What does he say at the very end? The four are those? Is that the four wounds?
4 wounds.
Okay.
Essentially, yes.
Okay.
And that the crown represents the crown of thorns. The crown of thorns is the thorns are what affect the inner personality. That is the crucifixion of the inner personality. St. Paul often wrote, John, we know that St. Paul often wrote about the thorn in the flesh. He suffered repeatedly what he called the thorn in the flesh, which I know must have been this irritant to the personality. It was a goad from God. It was the expression kicking against the pricks.
Mm.
Do you know what that means? The pricks are these metal goads that are pressed into the oxen's flesh, so that if the oxen tries to rebel, the pricks dig deeply into its flesh, and it gives it so much pain that it stops the struggle. Okay, this sounds gruesome, but this is what the crown of thorns does, and it prevents the inner personality from intervening, and it allows the rays of wisdom to then emanate. And I really, if you want to see examples of this, to me, if you watch that series, The Crown, about Queen Elizabeth, it's really very moving. And on the level of the level of that it really illustrates these principles that the emperor describes, because it shows Queen Elizabeth often in her position of this heavy crown, being in a position of heavy crown, and oftentimes she has to just do nothing. She's often asked to do nothing. She's meant to represent the throne. She's a representative of humanity ordained by divine authority, and it is a heavy role. Heavy, heavy. And it's so beautifully illustrated in that series. I highly recommend it, because she goes through these processes where you see what it means to be a part of a hierarchy, which is divinely granted, whether you believe this or not, doesn't matter. Divinely granted hierarchy that comes through the monarchy, and that this emperor grants kingship, and the ability for humanity to stand comes down from the very top, comes from this divine ordination. And she's ordained, the queen is ordained in the cathedral. It is before God that she is ordained. And her crown is very heavy. And she often has to put aside her personality and her personal interests and opinions. And you see it all the time. She is crucified on that throne of England. And it's mentioned in here a little bit about, Napoleon tried to become emperor and made the mistake of picking up the sword. So there you go. You cannot move forward with the sword. That will totally destroy. That will destroy the effort to be part of this hierarchy. Anyway, I'll stop. But very interesting. It's such an interesting interplay. The word hierarchy is often difficult for us to deal with. Maybe not for an Englishman, but I think for Americans, it's hard for us. Mark, did you have questions? Any questions that arose out of this that you just go, "What the heck? This is totally alien," or?
Ooh, I read through this letter several times, and it was, I think, one of the more difficult ones for me. And I don't know if that has to do with just where my head was the past couple of weeks, or if I wasn't as focused. But it's interesting that I also, along with John, did not arrive at contemplation. But hearing the way that you reasoned that out, I think it stands to reason.
What did you arrive
I
at?
think that what most resonated with me in this was toward the end of the letter, in which he's bringing it all back to practicality, which is one of the things that I've really enjoyed most about just diving into these letters, is that it's all rooted in practice. And I think that certainly one of the things I struggle with in my own life is this idea of that authority comes through renunciation. It's just not part of the way that I desire to be wired. I suspect it is part of the way that I am wired, but it's certainly taken me a long time to get to sort of renouncing some of those things that just stand as distractions in my life and have kept me from the practice. So I think that kind of on the surface, the initial thing that this letter spoke to me was about the ways in which I need to deny those baser aspects of myself that often stand as distractions and keep me from engaging in those spiritual practices, which I'm discovering do lead to just some muscles awakening that I was not aware of. And so I think that I can see how contemplation, and even just looking at the image now, I think that the contemplation is something that's starting to come out for me. Not sure that I communicated what I was what I'm thinking and feeling well, but just as a cursory answer to your question, I think those are some of the things that were coming up for me in this letter.
But I'd like to ask a question. You talked about that it makes you a little uncomfortable, the idea of authority and renunciation in order to develop authority. Is there, and I ask this of all of you, do we think that we have a rather deep-seated fear of accessing authority ourselves within ourselves? Because
If
because authority within ourselves will put us in a different position. He talks about freedom, and I didn't mention that, but a radical place of freedom, which people have different responses to that. When you have outer authorities to answer to, always answer to, you are able to defer to that authority. You are able to bow to that authority, and it takes that off your shoulders. You hence can say, I'm obeying the law. But he talks about, basically, he's talking about developing the inner law. That true law and order comes from the inner ordering of your own self, so that you take hold of your inner authority, and that puts you in a position of taking on radical freedom. What do you think about that? Authority, freedom, these are difficult words to work with.
I like the way he described and he talks about the 10 hierarchies, and they carry two things. One is existence, which is the freedom from the drop of the void. That's the source, the void that was created for us. And then second is essence, and that's the divine love, the spark of love. So it's the divine blood, the spark of love. And then for freedom to be able to come out of that. In fact, he calls about the drop of the void as immortal, because it's a void, it's indestructible. And that being a foundation for that freedom, that was created, how God stepped away. And how do you pronounce that word? How do you pronounce that word? The tistum. Simsom. And that Simsom, that's what set the foundation for that. So if you think of that freedom, and then he goes on later and he talks about the for the human to become so human that they, like David, he gives that example of King David, that he was the most human that there was. And that human, paradoxically, is then moving towards the divine. So if you become the most human you can become, it's that wonderful, that paradoxical aspect of it. So it's taking the human nature, it's crucifying the base parts of the human nature, but then allowing this essence and also the existence. They're both. It's not just pure essence. It is the existence, which is from the void as well. Thank you.
Thank you. That helped a lot.
Well, and then what he started talking about is the authority. In fact, you're talking about, Alice, all right, when you gave kind of the overall word contemplation for this, I struggled with that because the others were easier. I mean, the others, we have sacred magic, we have the mysticism, but for this one, I was struggling. What does this represent? And so all I could come up with was authority, but authority isn't sufficient, because really this fourth part is the Hermetic philosophical sense. That's what the fourth one is. And that is, as he describes, spiritual comprehension. And isn't that contemplation?
That's what
And
I'm
so yes, when you said contemplation, that hit like a bullseye for me. Authority didn't quite, but spiritual comprehension, because he gives the four senses. The first one, the mystical sense, he calls the spiritual touch. And then the Gnostic sense, he calls spiritual hearing. And then the magical sense, spiritual vision. But then this Hermetic philosophical sense, which is our letter 4, that is spiritual comprehension. Yeah. So
I think it does seem to make sense that I think that he's referred in a previous letter to this Hermetic philosophical sense as being a synthesis. And it makes perfect sense that synthesis takes place within contemplation. Yeah, thanks for teasing that out, Alice. Give me something to think about while I'm muddling my mind with this next letter.
He refers to, I'm making another correlation here. He refers to, when he's talking about freedom, let me find this. He talks about the inner sanctum. There was a phrase. There was a phrase here when I thought I wrote it down. Darn it. The sanctum imperium. The sanctum imperium is, I would say, this is the inner sanctum of spiritual authority. And I would say that the sanctum imperium, if the word contemplative is taken apart, it means contempling. It means templing with. Temple with, contempling. If you consider contempling as the moving into the inner sanctum imperium, that's what the spiritual exercise is about. And you need all these tools in order to access the keys to that inner sanctum imperium. But the freedom that comes thereof, the freedom that arises, is the key that you're trying to get to that, because that's the freedom which allows you to have full access to your immortality, which then makes you have all of those wonderful things that we love to have: courage, love, abundance. All of those things come from the immortal diamond that we are at the center of our being. But those have to be teased out. I like that phrase, teasing something out. I love that he's trying to explain what the Hermetic method is. And the Hermetic method, he's always trying to bring it out that it's expansive. So what he wants you to do is to expand. So don't try to define anything with one word, or so using contemplation, don't Don't pigeonhole it at all. Don't let me do that to you. Don't let me do that to you with that word, because that's not the Hermetic way. The Hermetic way would be to put, oh, contemplation. I will contemplate that. But there are other aspects. There's the authority. There's sacrifice. There's the void. There's these key words that they are all. He wants to expand your thinking. And this is what the Gospel of Thomas does. When we're working with the Gospel of Thomas, we talk about building those chords of resonances. And those are what arise out of the symbology that we're unpacking. It's pointing to these really deep truths. They're deep. It's pointing to the depths. And that's what we need to do. We need to go into the depths. And that's what developing the spiritual senses is about. And it is a practice. They are practices. And they're eminently practical. So that the person who goes and works in the soup kitchen and is dealing with sort of a flow of humanity that comes by them, and they're stuck behind the soup line, and no matter what happens, and even if there's something chaotic that happens, they have to stand their ground and keep ladling out the food. That's a spiritual practice right there. There's just one tiny example. That would be a Hermetic practice. So although he's explaining this in really abstract terms, we need to bring it down to the granular. We need to bring it down to our own experience. Thank you.
And that what you just said, Allison, also Mark too, was using this term that he used, which was initiation. And he starts with that, talking about the synthesis of mysticism, the gnosis, sacred magic, that constitutes initiation. And that's where eternity and present moment are one. That's his term, initiation. We're the same above as below. Then he goes on and talks about initiation through spiritual practices. And that is what renders one capable of knowing how to know. Then he goes into, so the initiate is one who knows how to attain knowledge. He knows how to ask, knows how to seek, and knows how to put into practice. And that is to be able to get to that point of the mystical experience, the Gnostic illumination, and the magical effect. And that is the synthetic comprehension, and that's the emperor. That is his description of the emperor. So synthetic comprehension, spiritual, he refers to that as synthetic comprehension, spiritual comprehension, and however we want to put that around contemplation, but it's all of those together, and it's the practice. It's the practice of doing that. And then giving the tools, but we still have to have volition. We still have to seek. We have to seek to be able to find. We have to be able to ask, to be able to get answers. And we have to be able to put it into practice. We have to do. Get out of that ivory tower and do.
Now that practice is what makes one, and Tomberg says this is what gives us an aptitude at these things. So we don't have to think, oh yes, I am renouncing my personal willpower to go and smack that person. You know what I mean? You don't have to go through everything. You become apt, you become adept at it. You become adept. And this is another word for an initiate. It's somebody who's an adept. So these mysterious words can be unpacked. Adeptness. And when you think about somebody who's very adept, somebody who's very adept, say socially, they just seem to be very graceful. They are graceful. That adeptness requires grace. And he distinguishes between moving along and doing things without allowing grace in. You can go on, if you're just a mechanistic scientist and you're not allowing for grace to come in, then you're a mechanistic empirical scientist, and your knowledge it'll just stay here. Unless you can allow grace to come in, you will not be opened up to that revelatory source, which is the revelatory source is opening your hatch to that. This is key to Hermetic philosophy. And that's how it differentiates. I love the way I struggled through studying Kant in college. I had to read, the Critique of Pure Reason. I had to read every single page of that book. And that's trends, and Kant got closest to me to what I was searching for something. I was searching for something. And Kant got close to it. And Tomberg calls him a transcendentalist, a transcendental philosopher. Okay. So he, Emerson, Thoreau, these are the thinkers who got close to it. But I love the way he just reduces them. Yeah, but Kant, the way he was thinking, that can all be summarized in the 18th Arcanum. And I'm just like, oh, mind blown. I mean, I love that. And I love that because even when I studied Kant, I knew that. I knew that Kant was only expanding a little tiny sliver of this world of inquiry, of this way of inquiry. And I knew, and I was never satisfied with studying philosophy. I always felt like it was like this, like there was just a limit. There was this limit just weighing down on me always, which I wanted to burst out of. And that's what Hermetic philosophy provided for me. Thank you.
I've been really excited by this because what I think most of you have been saying is what I've been feeling with the importance not only of Into Your Hands, O Lord, but standing up. And the practices, as it were, are actually initiating yourself into that aspect. So I found that really helpful. Thank you.
You
and
can
Alice,
yourself. That's your insight, John, from your own contemplative work.
And Alice, you mentioned the term in here that he used, which was alchemy. And the way, the way he used that too was saying, that the emperor stands for the throne of David. And that the more, and this is what I had alluded to, but I loved his terms of this, is that the more one becomes truly human, the more one manifests the divine element, the image and likeness of God. And that's the return to that true essence, to become truly human. And then and you in your summary talked about this sublimation, which was crucifying that which is base and blossoming the true essence. So here is the cross and the rose, just to give some meat on those bones.
Right. The Rosicrucian movement. The Rosicrucians are based on a really solid spiritual practice. It's what drew me to Rosicrucianism. There's all sorts of woo-woo around these different schools of thought. You've got your Templars and your Freemasons and your Rosicrucians, and then there's this whole mystique that's cast over them, sort of a mystery. But the fact is that it's these different schools are different schools of practice. They're different schools of practice. And if you put a bunch of several mystics from different traditions together, if you put a Jewish Kabbalist together with a Hindu saint, together with a Buddhist monk, and with a Christian mystic, if you put them all in the same room, they could all talk about the same spiritual practices. They would all have those in common. Oh yeah, of course. How's your meditation practice? Oh yes, I've been focusing on standing up in the hands of God. Oh, interesting. I like that. They would have plenty to talk about, and they would understand each other perfectly, wouldn't they? So it's that, and that is because they're all getting close to the source, the center, where they are beginning to get hints from the divine authority, which is leaking into their consciousness through their active imagination, the act of the empress or whatever. active imagination in working with actively with divine super consciousness. Because they've opened up to that, they then, it filters into them as like, this gives me the wisdom to have authority and to take this into myself for my own practices, and to understand this practice is experiential, and the more I practice this, the more I will develop my spiritual senses. Rudolf Steiner, who was Valentin Tomberg's teacher, one of his teachers, Rudolf Steiner wrote this book called How to Know Higher Worlds. What he was trying to demystify the entire process of spirit. He called it spiritual science. It's really interesting because he was trying to introduce this all to the West. He wanted to introduce it to the Western mind that didn't like any woo-woo mystical fluff. Here it is. Steiner just said in the early 1900s, he goes, people, look, you need to develop your spiritual sense of feeling, smell, taste, hearing, and sight. That's, clairvoyance, clairaudience. Well, and he teaches how to do that in this book. And he gives you granular exercises how to do it. I read How to Know Higher Worlds back early on, like really early. I discovered Steiner and I read that whole book. I read it a couple times. And I tell you, it was a way for me to grab on. And I did. It helped me grab on, and I practiced the exercises. I sat there and contemplated a freaking avocado seed for hours and hours and hours. I did his exercises. This is what it's all about. Very practical spiritual exercises to, as you say, Mark, strengthen those muscles. You're working on strengthening muscles that are not used to being, they're not used to being used. They need exercise. You got to have a spiritual gym.
I don't have my book yet, so I didn't read, but I'm just listening to the conversation. And what keeps coming up for me is I was fortunate enough to have a dark night experience that lasted about 2 years. And, it wasn't depression, checked off all the checklists, to make sure it wasn't something human, but it was definitely a dark night. And it was after a major head injury, and I had lost like a lot. I found out later in life, actually not too long ago, that I had a photographic memory. So when I hit my head, I lost that memory. Well, that memory used to be my toolbox. It was my spiritual toolbox. I could reach up and pull anything out. And as I'm listening to everybody, what keeps coming up for me is this dark night, because I have to look up words, like definition of words, right? So I looked up authority and I looked up freedom, and authority has one of the definitions was a natural authority, just simply recognizing one's knowledge, which we're talking about regarding God, the divine, and the essence. And freedom is the power and right to act, speak, and think as one wants without hindrance or restraint. So what I had noticed was, in walking out that dark night and really understanding the St. John of the Cross, and I was in it. I mean, I was dressed there. Coming through that and coming out of that, I basically learned that I had to die to myself to be able to know that the void is what you're talking about. I was in that void. I mean, I knew God existed, but I could not connect with that communication. However, what I realized, it was such a deep, it was a contemplation. It was such a deep moment I was doing things like learning how to take apart a computer and fix it because it was quiet, and I could get my mind wrapped up in that, but my heart and my being and my spirit were so wrapped up in something deeper that, this was just a sort of a momentary distraction to do something with my days. And the other thing I thought too, is as you're all talking, is like the Rule of Benedict. If you think about it, that guy was a silent monk, and he's living the life of contemplation. And what comes out of that is a Rule of Benedict that is now being followed all over the world, by many people. And to get to that type of, and I read the rule and I've written the rule out, and to get to that type of wisdom, again, I see authority and freedom in his work. So as you're talking about practicality, those are just some of the examples that I was sensing as you were all talking, or experiences. And John, like what you had in the hospital, I mean, I was seriously injured, and there was nothing else I could do but just hang out with God. There was just nothing else I could do. And so I felt when you said in my hands, I wrote it down the way you said it. I felt the same way. I had nowhere else to go but to the divine. I had just nowhere else to go.
Michelle, you had asked about the picture, and I'm going to put this up so you can just see it. That's in the book.
So you see his throne, and that he's not seated and he's not standing. His legs are crossed. I want you to note the crossed legs, by the way, because you're going to run across that again in the Hanged Man, upside down, the crossed legs.
Oh,
Just like that, like the number 4, okay? And notice, symbolically, that just came to me. His legs are crossed, makes the number 4. And the number 4 is the name of the number of the letter. Number 4 is the 4 wounds, the 4 methods, the four lower parts of the nature, the 4 parts of the human components that are going to be renounced. All that. Look at that. I just saw that in the 4 of his legs, you know. And keep that in mind, because when we come to the Hangman, and you could jump ahead and look at the Hangman letter if you want, but you'll see that same cross-legged stance, but upside down. But anyway, I got off because I was just wanting to describe that he's got a shield, and the shield, he's not holding the shield up protectively. The shield is sitting next to the throne. The shield is part of the throne, and his scepter is all he's looking at. He's not holding a sword, he's holding a scepter. Now, in one of my icons, I'll show you, Archangel Michael, same thing. I've been re-examining all of my icons, and here's my favorite one. This is Archangel Michael. Notice what he's holding.
Shield. A scepter.
Scepter and the globe with the cross on top of it. In other words, the earth under submission of the cross. And the Alpha and the Omega are written into that globe also. So wonderful. The symbols in this, you know, when I was writing this icon, the symbols in this just were so powerful. And every time I've, you know, looked at angel, and now if you look at angel icons, now Michael is sometimes depicted holding a sword. This is the thing, you know, he's also depicted holding the sword, and he's got the serpent under his feet, and he is vanquishing Satan. Okay, so he does use the sword, but I think it's by virtue of him being an archangel. Maybe he's allowed to wield a weapon. I don't know, because he knows how to wield it. But for us humans, the sword is not appropriate, only the scepter. And he holds the world in his hand. Michael, Archangel Michael, is the guardian of the entire world, of humanity, all the human races. That's what he's in charge of.
And here, Michelle, this is the Hangman. So you can see, if you make this speaker view, it's bigger too.
Yeah, that's what I have it on. Thank you.
Okay, good.
Which number is that? That's number 12.
This is number 12, yes.
You know, I was watching, this is sort of strange. I was watching the ID channel, which is those, you know, crime, murder type, stories. I just happened to have it on one day. And one of the victims fell with his legs crossed. And I wish I could remember what the investigators were saying. That was a very abnormal way for a human body to fall, was to have his legs crossed at the bottom. And so, if I ever come across it again, I'll be able to say it. But I thought that was sort of fascinating, that was not a norm. That was not a norm. There was a significance to that.
Yeah, so interesting. The Hangman has his hands tied behind his back, and his legs are crossed. And this is, again, the number 4, which is a multiple of letter 12. It's 4 times 3. So it's a multiple. And so we have 4, and then this will be one of those holographic resonances making a chord of symbology. And the fact that his hands are tied, think about that. And he's upside down, which is, it's another form of crucifixion here. So there's that, again, that idea of being restrained, like the emperor is restrained. He's holding the scepter, but he's neither stepping forward nor stepping back. and he's not standing. He is restrained. By the way, his other hand is on his belt. Remember, I forgot to talk about that. His other hand is restraining himself on his belt. He's holding his girdle, right? And he's holding the scepter. So he's in this position of being bound. The hanged man is completely bound and completely hanged and bound and helpless because he's hanging by one foot. He has absolutely no access to his own powers anymore. So there's a foreshadowing.
And here the emperor has ceded his own authority. You know, he is holding himself in.
He's holding himself back. And that holding back is creating it again. To me, it all works together with creating the void. And when you go into a state of contemplation, you are creating a void. You are practicing creating the void. Every time you go inward and contemple, you're accessing that void from which everything arises.
And you're also restraining in a sense, in a sense, we're restraining our personal will to do something else. If you listen to people trying to contemplate, they're like, the hardest thing I have to do is sit for 20 minutes. I hear it all the time. So in a way, we're sort of restraining our humanness to meet the divine.
Absolutely. When I'm out of practice with my centering prayer, it's just amazing. I sit there and go, I sit there twitching. I'm thinking about everything. I have 10,000 thoughts. And of course, Father Keating is famous for saying to the nun who came up to him and said, "Oh, that was so hard. I had 10,000 thoughts in 20 minutes. 10,000 thoughts." And he said, "Oh, isn't that wonderful? 10,000 opportunities to return to God." You hold on to those ideas. Like that's helpful. That's a tool he gave you. Keep practicing. Doesn't matter. 10,000 things. In the Tao, it's the 10,000 things of the Tao. All of it must be renounced. And the Tao, I love reading the Tao because the Tao talks about renunciation all the time. Renouncing the 10,000 things.
One thing that really struck home with me very hard, when he was talking about the void, and I was trying to come to terms with this not terribly easy concept, he was saying that when God was actually beginning to create, he had to begin with the void. You have to begin with the contraction and giving space so that other things can happen. And then when other things do happen, you have to respect that. And when they go round the bend and start abusing their freedom, you can't just say, no. You have to let them, like the prodigal, come back in their own good time. And it made a deal of sense too when he was saying a lot of traditional occult thought would say we've got this continuous sort of wheel of existence. Evolution, you're coming down from God, and then involution is that you're going back up, or is it the other way around? I've forgotten. But you've got this process that goes on and on and on. And he says, no, that is not the key to the universe. The key to the universe is actually God beginning with the void, giving with the freedom, and being prepared to take what this gift of freedom to others actually means. Thank
Yeah,
you.
he talks about the center of he talks about that Zen statement about the center of the carriage wheel, the hub, the center which all the spokes are attached to. But it's the center of that wheel, that void, that allows it to be a powerful wheel. That allows it to be a powerful tool. That's beautiful, John, though. That's really true, that it's that void that's created. I look at it as the in-breath of God. I like to think of it physically as being I practice yoga and thinking of the in-breath. And you hold it. You hold the in-breath. And you're reiterating, creating that void before you exhale. And And when you leave the world, the last thing you do is exhale. First thing you do is inhale, which is creating a void. Diaphragm lifts. And then when you leave, you exhale. So these images all work together. And the Hindus do say that the universe is the breath of God, the word of God that emanates from Brahman. It's just a great big breathing in and out.
Mm.
I love the dynamic of that, because a universe that's just breathing in and out, wow. That image works for me symbolically. But I don't want to get caught up in that either, because I could just be like, well, it doesn't fit in with my theory of the in-breath and out-breath of the universe. Again, Hermetic thinking is holding all of these possibilities. It's about learning both and thinking, and being willing to hold paradox lightly, because that's what develops depth. People that have just only linear thinking see things in very few shades of subtlety at all. So discernment is what allows us to hold multiple things in our consciousness and allow them to blossom instead of shutting things down, allowing them all to blossom. And those all feed the roots of our being. They all feed the trunk of our existence and essence as Hermetic philosophers. And I want to congratulate you for getting through this chapter, because as I was reading it, this letter, very difficult and very abstract, and I got lost. I nodded off. I was like, oh boy. And I had to hit it afresh again. It's, this is really tough going. And I was thinking, if these guys can stick through this stuff, I'm used to it. I was a philosophy major. Okay. I'm used to it. And John, to an extent, you're used to it too. You've sat through many, many theology classes and many, many hermeneutics classes, and you're used to that too. But this is not easy. But I loved, Mark, that you said, oh, thank God, at the end, he got back to the practical. Mm-hmm. And, he does. That's the great thing about Tomberg. He's taking you way out here, and then suddenly he goes, but to bring it back to brass tacks. I love that. That's the only thing that keeps me going sometimes. I'm sure you will agree.
Yeah, I just really appreciated the focus in this letter on dignifying our humanity. And I think we don't always focus well on Jesus being this, on the humanity of Jesus, in the way that I think that probably one of the things he was trying to teach us is how to be human. And it's interesting. I spend usually 8 or 10 weeks in the summer. I get out of the city every week, and I have the privilege of taking high school students that are usually from typically they're like sort of fundamental whack job, conservative sort of backgrounds, mostly Texan kids, into the mountains, and we focus on contemplative practice for 3 days, experiencing our Creator and creation, and slowing down. And then we take them into the city and mix them in with this street kid community, and it's a weekly experiment in chaos and madness, and it's a lot of fun. But I found as I've been reading through these letters, I hear the words that come out of my mouth in the mountains being grounded in something that I didn't have a perspective for. And it's been interesting to see the ways that that just my life and my practice and my calling and being reflected in this stuff. So I really appreciated that focus on how is it that we can be truly human, because that is in itself a place in which we reflect the divine and we meet the divine. And that certainly was not part of the good news that I was exposed to probably in my youth. And also, I just wanted to mention, John, I really appreciate your sharing with us this meditation you've been focusing on and standing within the hands of God, because I think that gives me something to lean into a little bit. I feel like I've felt a lot of comfort in resting in God's hands, but that's also a place in which I've done a lot of sleeping. And sleeping in God's hands seems probably like a great place to spend your time sleeping. But I think that as I find myself waking up, that standing up might go along with that, or at least learning to recline like this emperor. Maybe I don't need to find my 2 feet, but definitely standing and reclining on the one leg might be a good place for me to move toward.
Well, I've got right about 10 o'clock. And what, just to shift one moment, do you think that we've summarized it well enough to end our session for 2 weeks? If so, what I'm going to do is I will be sending out the invitation the day before. And I know, Alice, that's not what I typically did. Before, I did a couple days before to give people a chance to go ahead and read their chapter of the book. Well, guess what? If you haven't read this in 2 days before, you're already way behind. So I'll just do it. I'll do it the day before. Other groups appreciate the day before because people get so filled up with emails that
Exactly.
yeah. So I'll be sending it out the day before, and just, look for a passcode and I will put that in there as tarot. I understand you all didn't need it this time. There's some transition that Zoom's going through. So just be aware of that.
Also, though, Miller, I wonder, you might want to ask her if she wants a notification a little earlier than that, since she had trouble like juggling everything and remembering to come to this. But then again, everyone's got their own rhythm here, and it's good that we're recording it, so then people can digest it on their own. I want to also take this opportunity of housekeeping moment to tell you that my new website has just launched like yesterday or the day before. It's magisterium.com. I will just send you the link. I'd love to get your feedback on it, the navigation through it. It's if I do say so myself, it's terribly rich. It's wonderful. It has a whole section of my inspired writings, of which some of them, you might want to read. There's one called Freedom, the Keynote. And they directly relate probably to the richness that I accrued through, I don't take credit for these writings, but through the richness of reading the Tomberg book years ago. I'm sure it helped me with accessing some of this wisdom. And there's some very wonderful writings in there that are under the inspired writing section. There's several sections. There's a whole section on pilgrimage. There's a whole section called Sound and Vision, which is about my music, my art. There's a beautiful service of Compline in there, John, of Sung Compline you might enjoy. That was a Good Friday Sung Compline that I did with a quartet of women. Beautiful. And I just found that again. And I would like to, with your permission, when I get myself together with the web designer for knowing how to upload things, I would like to have permission to upload one of our sessions here of the meditations. You can turn off the recording, Dory, if you want. This is, this is housekeeping.